little history. In 1690, an English explorer made the first confirmed reference to the Falkland Islands, however they may have been discovered earlier. In 1765, the British first established a colony on Saunders Islands and claimed the archipelago, unaware that the French had established a colony on East Falkland the previous year. The French agreed to hand over their colony to the Spanish in 1767, and then the Spanish pushed the British out of their colony in 1770, but threats of war allowed the British to return. Revolutions in the Americas forced both the Spanish and British to abandon the islands, and they remained abandoned until the newly independent Argentinians allowed a German merchant, Louis Vernet, to establish a settlement on the islands. However, he also made pacts with the British for protection. The Argentines made him governor in 1829, which, along with fishing rights disputes, angered the British, so in 1833 they re-established themselves on the island by force. From then on, the British held the island, although the Argentinians continued to assert their claims diplomatically. Fast forward to 1976, and the Argentinian military staged a coup and George Rafael Videla took power. The repressive junta began to push to expand their borders. For instance, in 1978, the Beagle conflict brought the nation on the brink of war with Chile over islands in the Tierra del Fuego. In December 1981, Leopoldo Galtieri took over the junta, but he needed to gain public support as the country's economy was crumbling. So, advised by George Anania, Commander-in-Chief of the Navy, he prepared to take the Falklands. They assumed that there would not be a war, because the UK had made large cuts to their armed forces, and because it was too difficult for the British to fight a war in such an isolated place. In March 1982, the Argentine military escorted a group of civilians who had a contract to remove scrap metal from South Georgia Island, over 1,000 kilometers east of the Falklands, and hoisted the Argentinian flag. Then, before the British could act and reinforce their position in the South Atlantic, the Argentinians launched an invasion of the Falklands and South Georgia Islands in early April, easily capturing the undefended island. In Buenos Aires, thousands celebrated their victory, unaware that the British under Margaret Thatcher were in fact planning to respond. The British dispatched a large task force, while the UN failed to secure a diplomatic solution. After weeks at sea, a small unit of Marines recaptured South Georgia Island in late April, while the larger force pushed onto the Falklands, arriving in early May. British Sea Harriers managed to defend their navy despite being heavily outnumbered, and a British submarine controversially sank the Belgrano, which carried Exocet missiles, forcing the Argentine navy to withdraw. But the British still did not have air superiority, and the Argentines managed to sink a destroyer, HMS Sheffield. Nevertheless, on the 21st of May, with winter approaching, 4,000 British troops landed in the lightly defended San Carlos Bay. The Argentines responded by launching continuous air assaults and destroyed the British container ships carrying helicopters. So, with no transport left, the British soldiers set off on foot. Most of the troops travelled the 120 kilometers over tough terrain to the capital Port Stanley, while another 500 marched to an Argentinian garrison at Goose Green. On the 29th of May, after fierce fighting, the British emerged victorious at Goose Green and gained the morale boost they required. Meanwhile, the other force was only 12 miles from Port Stanley, but around 10,000 Argentinians, albeit inexperienced conscripts, were entrenched into hills, blocking their way. The British numbers were bolstered as reinforcements arrived in early June, and on the 11th of June, the British were ready to launch their assaults. Using the cover of night, they were able to drive the Argentinians from Mount Harriet, Langdon and Two Sisters. On the 13th, more successful night assaults drove the Argentinians from Wireless Ridge and Tumbledown, the last natural defences of Port Stanley. The Argentines fled back to Port Stanley, but as they did, morale and discipline broke down, and with the city surrounded, the Argentines surrendered on the 14th of April, ending the war. In Britain, the war helped Margaret Thatcher gain public support and win the election the following year, and successive governments have improved the defences on the islands. But for the junta in Argentina, the surrender proved to be their downfall, as they relinquished power in 1983. However, the sovereignty of the islands is still disputed, and in recent years, the Argentinians have begun pushing once again to take control of them.